Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini. I post weekly videos right here on my YouTube channel, and this video is video number 2 of my Tulipán video quilt along. Now I will warn you, this video is kind of long, but it covers a lot of information that you'll need, especially if you're a beginner to foundation paper piecing. First, we'll start off talking about 2 different options that you have for the paper that you'll print your foundation on. Another note I want to mention here is that in the description box below the video is a link on where you can go to download the foundation that we'll be using for this Tulipán block. Remember, you'll need to print out 20 copies because we do need an actual paper foundation for each individual block that we'll be making in the quilt. Next, I'll cover the fabrics that you need to make the black blocks, what I'm calling the black blocks. It's the ones with the stained glass black strips here, and the video did turn out to be quite long, so instead of cramming it onto one super long video, I cut it into 2. So in this video, video number 2, we're gonna cut out the fabrics and the pieces that we need to make these blocks, and then in video number 3, we'll tackle the red blocks I'm calling, which have the little stripping here made up of the red fabric. And so you basically have a lot of prep work, homework to do before we actually jump into the sewing part on the foundations. So now let's talk foundation paper and how to prep our squares and jump right into cutting the fabric pieces that we'll need for the black blocks. Now to get started with any foundation paper piecing project, you're going to need to have the foundation template or design already printed out on the sheets of paper before you can start sewing, because you have to sew on this paper and we're going to follow the lines. Now 2 different options that I often will use are newsprint, which is what I'll be using here since I already had it on hand, and then the other one is paper solvy, and this is a product that's made by Sulky. It comes in a pack like this already at 8.5 by 11 sheets, so that you can run them similar to regular sheets of paper through your printer to print out the design. Now for the design, I've included a link for you in the description box below this video, and also in the little lowercase letter I that you see there on the top right hand corner. So either of those are going to take you to where you need to go so that you can download the actual template piece. Now remember, you'll need to print it out 20 times. Now you can also use regular printer paper. What I would recommend is that you try to get the thinnest paper that you have. So I will show you what this paper solvy looks like, and this comes in a pack like this. It includes 12 sheets, and you can see it's pretty sheer, okay, very thin, and again, this is a water-soluble product. Of course, I'll include a link on where you can find the same paper that I use, and also on where you can find the paper solvy. The next step is to take the printed foundations and trim them down. You can do this in a couple different stacks, especially if you're working with thinner paper, but you want to cut to the exterior of the lighter line. So if we're looking at these, I'll tell you what they mean. The lightest line, which is the outermost line, is your seam allowance line. All right, so your block needs to be individually cut at that line. If you go inside about 1/4 of an inch in, you'll see a darker, more bold line, and that represents your seam, where you're going to sew it in. So you do not want to trim away that additional 1/4 inch. That's your seam allowance accounted for. So when you trim this down, really what you're doing is just trimming down some of the excess paper. So we're working with smaller foundations, and this is just a step that I prefer to do. All right, repeat that so you have 20 freshly trimmed and prepped foundations to be ready to sew. Then we're going to set that aside, and now let's talk fabric. Now when we talk about fabric and the pieces that we'll be sewing in to create each block, no matter which way you look at it, with foundation paper piecing, there is going to be some waste. No matter how accurate we try to cut the measurements and position them and everything, there's definitely it's inevitable for you to have some trimming that needs to come away. So there are a few different ways, and I would say the 2 most popular ways that I've seen and that I have personally used is, 1, a technique where you're just working with a random measured piece or scrap of fabric, and you're kind of just making sure that it's way bigger than what you need, and you kind of end up with a lot more waste than what I prefer. So instead, there's another way to do it, and it involves definitely some math, where you basically take the individual units that need to be covered by a specific fabric, you measure them, add seam allowances, and then you cut your fabric pieces down to those sizes so that you ensure that it is enough, okay, something like this. It's enough to cover the piece that we need, but then there's still enough excess sticking out that we will trim some down and we don't end up running the risk of having any of our fabric pieces be shorter than what we need, because that is definitely a headache. And here is a block where you can see it's already been trimmed to that outer light line. That's my seam allowance. And if you look right here, I'm short about a 1/16 of an inch down here and about a 1/4 of an inch here. There's no way that I can stitch this in without going bigger than a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and having that get caught in there. So basically this whole thing is messed up because I was a little bit short and I didn't really account for the proper measurement or size for this unit here, okay? So we're gonna try to avoid that. But if you're new to foundation paper piecing, I would recommend then maybe you cut the pieces based off of the measurements that I'm going to give you and just kind of allot yourself a little bit extra just in case. But I'm going to show you my tips and tricks on how I line things up to make sure that I do get all the coverage that I need for each individual block, like this one, all right, where everything reaches exactly and as far out into the seam allowances as it needs to. All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about measurements and cutting our fabric pieces down to size. So we're going to cut everything that we need for all our blocks, and then in the next video of the series, we'll actually get to the sewing part, because there is quite a bit of prep work to complete 20 blocks that each feature 13 individual fabric pieces. So let's start off with A1. And A1, if we look over here at the finished block, you can see that A1, as well as A6, A12, and A13 are 1, 2, 3, and 4 of our background pieces. So that's going to be whatever the lightest fabric you chose. In my case, that white with that metallic hatch design. So that's what I'm going to set aside. I'm going to press this fabric flat and then we'll cut it up. All right, so for our background fabric and the pieces that we need to cut, we have 5/8 of a yard. We're first going to start off cutting the larger pieces that go on this corner. And for this, you can see that they are basically mirror imaged. And I will show you some cut ones so you can kind of see what I mean. Means this triangle, the angle goes that way, and to cover on the other side, it needs to go this way. That means that we need to cut some rectangles on the diagonal face up and some face down. So let's take it step by step. First, we're going to cut out the square units that we're then going to cut along the diagonal. Excuse me, the rectangular units. So from my 5/8 of a yard here, I'm going to cut an 8-inch strip. I'll just use this ruler. So I'm going to measure 8 inches. And these are going to measure 4 by 8. So we're first going to cut it down to 8 inches. And we need 2 cuts like this. So there's one piece of 8 inches. And the second. Okay. We're going to go back and subcut these, but these will be used for the smaller units that we're going to cut in here. And because each one of our blocks feature 2 of these and 2 of these, we need to end up with 40 total of each of these, because 2 of them are getting taken up by each block. So from this remaining chunk of your yardage, and remember, if you don't tend to cut very accurately, then you're probably going to want to use more yardage, but this is it's kind of tight for cutting all these pieces out. Now this measures about 6.5 or so inches, and so we're going to cut this in half. Doesn't have to be perfect, but basically 3 1/4-ish, somewhere in the middle there. All right, let's set these aside. Let's cut the big ones up first. From the 8-inch wide chunks, first we trim our selvage. And then we're going to subcut these into 4-inch strips. So we're going to get all these rectangles that measure 4 by 8. And you should be able to get 10 from each strip. And they're doubled up, so this is 2. So there's 10, and this is a little bit of waste. And let's cut 10 more from the second strip. So we've cut 20 rectangles that measure 4 inches by 8 inches. Now we're going to cut them on the diagonal, but notice that I have kept these rectangles the same way that they were folded up. So this is the pretty side of the fabric, this is the pretty side of the fabric, and they should be wrong sides touching. That's going to give me a set of 2 that are going to be for one side, and the opposite mirror image cut that's on the bottom is going to be for the other side. So the best way really is to kind of go sorting them out as you go. One for this side of the block and one for this side, because you want to make sure that you end up with 20 in this orientation and 20 in this one. Don't just lay all these face up and cut them, because you're not going to have the opposite pieces that you need, and you will be out of yardage. So if I cut these on the diagonal through both layers, the top two, you can see, if I turn it, go the same orientation. And the bottom two go the same orientation, which is the mirror image of these guys. So now I have 2 and 2 of this, and you can see that that is how they need to be for the blocks. All right, so I'm going to continue to do that until I end up with 20 like this and 20 like this. Now that we have 20 triangles for this side and 20 for this side, let's set it aside and grab the other strips that we cut so we can cut out the units that we need for A1 and A6. First, we trim our selvage, and then we're going to subcut these down into chunks of 4 inches. And you can see that one is a little bigger. That's okay, as long as it's a minimum of 3 inches by 4 inches. So it already is a little bit more than 3 going that way, and we're going to cut at 4. And again, you should be able to get 10 from each of these strips. Now you'll see that from the allotted 5/8 of a yard, all we're able to get are the pieces that we need for the corner triangles and these rectangles to fit for units A1 and A6. So the way that I usually do it is that I will cut these on a diagonal, and I will admit that it is a very, very tight fit, and you have to make sure that you're grabbing the right one to fit the right side of either A1 or A6. So for a beginner, I would not recommend this. Instead, I would recommend that you get just a little more fabric from this and allot yourself one of these 3-inch by 4-inch rectangles per section here. In other words, instead of just getting 20 of these, make sure that you cut out 40 of them. And just so you see how it's going to come together, instead of slicing it on the diagonal and having to work with a triangle and angling it correctly to fit in this section, which is a little bit hard, and you need to be quite experienced with foundation paper piecing, this is the easier way to do it, where we just take one of them and use it to cover the entire section. Now, because the section is a little bit smaller, you see that you get some waste on the sides, but for beginners, this is how I would recommend you do it. So if you went ahead and just got the 5/8 of a yard of your background fabric, see if you can get your hands on a little bit more, or just pick a different background fabric that will allow you at least 3/4 of a yard or so you can cut out some more strips and double this up. Instead of 20, go ahead and cut out 40 rectangles at 3 inches by 4 inches at least, and we'll use it like this when we get to piecing. Now let's move on to the stained glass stripping that we need for the blocks. Remember, there will be 10 black blocks and 10 of these red ones. For this, all you need to do is cut out a bunch of 1-inch wide strips of the fabric that you're using for the stained glass stripping part here. And I don't subcut them down to size yet, because you'll see I find that it's just easier to cut it as you work with it. So these 2 little strips here are going to be shorter than the rest of them. Some of them are longer. These 2 are the same length. You'll cut it there, you know, once we get to that part of stripping or piecing those strips in. And then it's easier and quicker. Just cut a bunch of strips of the fabric, and they're all 1 inch wide. So cut a bunch and kind of leave them as you go. Don't cut up all your yardage, because in this case, this print will be used for a border on the outside 4 sides of our quilt top. And then I'm going to use some of my red fabric for my quilt binding. So I don't want to cut up all my yardage into the strips, but go ahead and start off with cutting 5 to 6 strips of each of the fabrics at 1 inch wide by the width of the fabric. Then once you have that done, go ahead and set that aside, and we'll move on to the fabrics that are in the inside patchwork pieces of our Tulipán flower. Focusing on the black block first, we're going to look at section A9, all right? And this one here, to cut the triangles that we're going to use for this largest chunk, we're going to cut rectangles that measure 6 inches this way by 9 inches tall. Okay, so 6 by 9. And then after you have that, go ahead and cut it along the diagonal. Now for this one, It doesn't really matter if you're cutting it with the pretty side of the fabric face up or pretty side face down, like the mirror image, because they're both cuts are still large enough to cover the piece that we need. And if you're ever not sure, just go ahead and lay it in there and see if you can get it to cover, including the seam allowances on all sides. And that would be the one that was cut pretty side up. And let's turn this one over. This would be what is the mirror image of this first cut. And so typically it would go on this side, but you can see that it's large enough to still give us the coverage that we need for this unit. So there will be some maneuvering that we'll do when we get to the piecing part, but I know that I still have plenty, including seam allowance, to go around of this entire chunk. So again, there's only 10 blocks that are the black like this. So all you need to cut out are 5 rectangles at 6 by 9, slice them along the diagonal, and you'll end up with the 10 units that you need for the 10 blocks that look like this one. Once you have those 10 triangles, we can set those aside and let's move on to the next fabric. Now for unit A3 in the black block, we're gonna need 10 rectangles that measure 3 inches by 4 inches. And you can see again, we'll do a quick little measurement to make sure that it covers that whole area. All right, so set those aside. Now let's see about this one. So for section A7 here of the black block, we're going to cut out rectangles of the swirly fabric that measure 4.5 inches by 6.5 inches. And then I go and cut these on the diagonal. Now for this one, we do want them all to be angled in this direction. So instead of cutting some face up and some face down, which will yield you mirror image, go ahead and just cut each individual rectangle on the diagonal pretty side face up. In other words, you don't want to end up with one that looks like this because it's already going to be a little bit of a tight fit to get it in here. But if it's going in the opposite direction or is the mirror image of this one, it's going to be even tougher for you to kind of figure out how to orient this one here for sewing it in. All right, so cut them all on the diagonal with the pretty side of the fabric face up, just like this. If this was my rectangle, there's nothing behind it, no mirror image ones underneath, and cut on the diagonal. And for this, again, you're gonna need 10 of them. So just cut yourself 5 rectangles, 4.5 inches by 6.5 inches, and cut each one along the diagonal with pretty side face up so that you end up with 10 units that will fit right here for section A7. Now let's quickly recap the pieces that we need for the 10 black blocks, I'm calling these. So our background pieces are these 4 sections here. We have these 2 that were cut from rectangles along the diagonal, and we made sure to end up with 20 that face this way and 20 that are the mirror image of this, because this is what you'll need for all 20 blocks, 2 per block. And then we also have these rectangular units here. Remember I said go ahead and cut more of your background fabric so you end up with 40 of these rectangles at 3 inches by 4. We'll use 1 per each of these sections. Then for the inside patchwork pieces, we have the larger ones that we cut just from 5 of them that were pretty side face up. The same thing for this one, from 5 rectangles that we cut along the diagonal. And then for the center one here, just the 10 rectangles that measured 3 by 4. So these are all the ones that you need. Oh, and the strips here. Remember, we just cut them at 1 inch wide by the width of the fabric. We cut about 5 or 6 to start with, okay? So these are all the pieces that you need so you can start foundation paper piecing our black block. All right, so as you can see, quite a bit of homework and prep work that needs to be done before we can move along to the next step in this process. Remember, if you're new to this type of technique, to foundation paper piecing, make sure that you have more than enough fabric than what I've allotted for in these cuts and in the overall project, because I can almost guarantee that even if you have some experience with paper piecing, there's almost always some little mistake or mishap that happens along the way. So this is not the project where you want to have just enough fabric to get you by. Make sure that you cut your pieces even bigger than what I've covered, especially if this is your first time with this type of a project, and then you should be good to go. So go ahead and cut up all your fabric pieces for those black blocks. In the next video, I will meet you back here and we'll go over the fabric measurements we need to cut for the red blocks, and then we'll finally, in the following video after that one, get into paper piecing. Tips and tricks on how to get successful blocks pieced together using a foundation template. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial, and if you did, make sure to hit it with a thumbs up below, share it across the different social media sites, and don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of my future videos. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye. And as long as you have extra fabric to work with, you'll be plenty fine. Prep work and homework to do. Go ahead, Go ahead, really. Right here on my YouTube channel, and this video is video number 2. Number. I like this new do. It's funky.